All right, let's kick off this deep dive with something that really grabbed me. Imagine you're in ancient Babylon. Not royalty, not a priest, just a reasonably well-off person.
Okay.
And part of your everyday outfit, your personal ID, basically. Carved into this little stone cylinder, maybe on a string, like a cool functional accessory.
That detail, the seal cylinder,
Mm,
as just part of ordinary dress, it's fantastic, isn't it? Really tells you something unique straight away.
it totally does. Or, okay, how about this one? The source we're digging into reveals that even the king's son might be involved in, like the wool trade, acting as a merchant through agents.
Yeah, that sounds a bit weird from our modern perspective, doesn't it?
Right. It flips some assumptions.
Exactly. And that's the real value of digging into these old sources.
Precisely. So that's our mission today. We're taking a deep dive into the civilization, the life, the customs of the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians. And our guide is this fascinating older handbook. It was put together by specialists who went straight to the original stuff, inscriptions, official records, thousands of these personal contract tablets written on clay.
Yeah, think of it like we're peering over the shoulders of the first scholars who really started making sense of all this, translating those whispers from the clay.
Perfect way to put it. So we're going to unpack this material, pull out the most important nuggets, and try to get a real feel for what life was actually like back then.
We'll probably uncover some surprising things.
Definitely. And see how complex and sometimes how weirdly relatable their world could be.
Okay, so let's start with the people themselves. Who
Uh,
was actually living there in Mesopotamia, particularly Babylonia? It's really important to get that it wasn't just one group. There were layers.
Right. Built up over time.
Exactly. The foundation, the, let's say, original culture creators, those were the Sumerians.
Ah, the Sumerians. Often credited with inventing, well, a whole lot of stuff, right?
Yeah. Pretty much. They spoke these unique languages, agglutinative dialects, basically sticking lots of bits onto words to change the meaning. Very different from, say, Semitic languages.
In writing.
Critically, yes. They invented that first pictorial writing system that eventually became cuneiform, which was the script for the whole region for thousands of years. They built the first big cities, the temples.
Yeah.
They were essentially the cultural teachers for the Semitic peoples who came later.
And that Sumerian influence was just massive, wasn't it? The source points out that early on, Sumerian language and script were so dominant, it's actually hard for historians to tell if some early rulers were Semitic because their names are given in Sumerian forms.
That shows you just how powerful that early culture was. And yeah, the Semitic groups who moved in, they learned city life from the Sumerians. Even their words for basic urban concepts like city or palace seem to be derived from Sumerian terms.
So they literally learned the words for these things from them.
It suggests they encountered these ideas for the first time through the Sumerians. So for centuries, you have this amazing period of mixing, Semites, Sumerians living side by side, influencing each other.
Like a melting pot.
Yeah. The source uses a great analogy. It says the resulting mix of people, language, religion was as composite as modern England. You can find members of the same family with names from different language groups.
Wow.
That blend was really where the culture was forged. Then you get Sargon of Akkad and his empire. Now that culture he spread, while built on the Sumerian foundation, had become essentially Semitic. It had transformed what they'd learned.
So by Sargon's time, they'd sort of merged.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Sumerians and Semites had effectively become one people under this new, evolving civilization.
Hmm.
But the layering didn't stop there.
Okay.
The source mentions the Khalda, or Chaldeans, probably another Semitic group down in the southern marshes. Their name later became so prominent it was sometimes used for the whole population, linked to figures like King Merodach Baladan, maybe even Nebuchadnezzar later on.
Ah, the Chaldeans, right.
And the source even hints there might have been other elements, maybe a third race contributing some family names, just adds another layer of complexity.
So the Babylonian we think of was really this mix, Sumerian, Semitic, Kassite elements later on.
A real compound. And what's fascinating is the perspective in this old handbook. It actually claims these mixed races were invariably the best. It explicitly contrasts the Babylonians favorably with the Assyrians, who it sees as more purely Semitic.
Whoa, that's quite a judgment. Why did they think that?
Well, the source argues Assyrian culture was mostly just imitating Babylonia, that the Assyrians really only excelled at war, not the arts of peace. It even points out that the Assyrian gods basically migrated north from Babylonia.
So a clear bias in that source towards Babylon.
Definitely a perspective favoring that rich blended culture.
Okay, so that's the complex human geography. Now this is where I think it gets really interesting. How did the land itself, the environment, shape their lives? We're talking Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers.
Well, it was incredibly fertile, that plain. So agriculture was absolutely central, the heart of the economy. But it wasn't easy farming.
Oh, how so?
It demanded constant work. They had to be irrigators, engineers, almost before they were farmers. The land was naturally marshy, and the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, prone to massive floods, especially after the winter rains.
So it wasn't just a case of scattering seeds. It took serious effort to make it productive.
Absolutely. Controlling the water, draining the marshes to turn them into fields, building and maintaining these complex networks of canals, embankments.
Mm.
The irrigator's job was never done. The source is clear. Agriculture and engineering were born directly out of the challenges of that landscape.
And being near the sea, with those rivers as natural highways, that must have pushed them towards trade, too.
Definitely. The source even quotes this ancient description of the cry of the Chaldeans in their ships. It's a great image. They set up trade routes, going amazing distances down to southern Arabia for spices, over to Egypt, up into the highlands of Western Asia.
Wow.
Early cities like Eridu were actually seaports back then. Had its own specific kind of boat. So while most people farmed, the towns really thrived on trade.
And that fertility you mentioned, it was legendary.
Oh yeah. The source cites Herodotus being amazed by it, grain yields of 200, even 300 times what was sown. He described wheat and barley leaves 3 inches wide, millet stalks incredibly tall.
Hard to believe, almost.
Some naturalists even think Babylonia might be where cultivated cereals like wheat actually originated.
An agricultural powerhouse. But you said it was challenging.
Right. And one big challenge was the lack of stone. But they had clay, endless amounts of clay. So the source stresses the art of brickmaking was one of their earliest, most fundamental inventions. Sun-dried bricks, later kiln-fired, often mixed with chopped reeds for strength, using clay itself or bitumen as mortar.
Which explains all the brick architecture, and you see those huge platforms.
Exactly. Because the ground was marshy, prone to floods, they had to build everything up high on platforms of brick or packed earth.
Which led to those mounds, the tells.
Precisely. As old buildings collapsed and new ones were built on top, the cities literally grew upwards over centuries, forming these artificial hills. And they got creative with the brickwork recessed panels, patterns of colored clay cones stuck into the walls, painted stucco with figures, animals, ways to break up the monotony.
And the Assyrians copied this, even though they had stone.
Interestingly, yes, Assyria had stone, but they still copied the Babylonian style of brick architecture, including the platforms and even the painted reliefs, which might have originated as a substitute for carved stone. Shows the cultural influence.
They like the look, I guess. So, okay, grand structures outside. What about inside their homes? What kind of furniture did they have?
Well, we get clues from Assyrian reliefs, which, again, probably copied Babylonian styles. And they suggest furniture could be quite artistic. Chairs, very simple stools, chairs with backs and arms. Some were apparently so high they needed footstools.
Footstools, an ancient tradition.
The source notes that, wealthier homes would have cushions, embroidered tapestries, couches, bedsteads.
Sounds surprisingly comfortable, actually.
And their everyday objects show skill, too. Vases made from stone, pottery, metals like copper and bronze, later iron, even, eventually, glass and porcelain. The source mentions an Egyptian alabaster vase found in Babylonia.
Yeah.
Probably war booty taken by Naram-Sin centuries earlier.
Wow, that's evidence crossing millennia.
It is. And contracts list purchases copper kettles, cups, jugs. An inventory from an innkeeper lists bedsteads, chairs, dishes, and a brazier. The source thinks braziers might have been a Babylonian invention that spread elsewhere, like to Judah. Tables came in different shapes. Some even had shelves.
Braziers for heating or cooking? Amazing. What about clothes? What did they wear?
It varied over time and by social class. The upper classes often wore conical caps or these high tiaras seen as a really old Babylonian survival. Long fringed robes were common, often sleeveless. Sometimes capes, which the source says were maybe more Babylonian than Assyrian.
And status symbols.
The parasol was a big one, a sign of royalty or high rank. Underneath the robes, tunics were common, maybe layered in colder weather. Drawers seem to have been rare, possibly only for soldiers in later Assyria. Priests had very specific gear, a flounced dress and a goat's skin.
Did the style change much?
Yeah, in the earliest times, kilts, short or long, were common. But by Sargon's era, that long robe, often worn draped over one shoulder, became pretty standard. And interestingly, men's and women's dress wasn't hugely different. Women wore long robes too.
How much effort did they put into, like, grooming, hair and stuff?
A lot, it seems,
Mm.
especially hair and beards, and particularly among the Semitic population, the earlier Sumerians. They generally had less facial hair, often shaved their heads. But once Semitic rulers took over, elaborate beards, whiskers, mustaches, even artificial curling became the fashion. You see it on carvings of Naram Sin, Hammurabi.
They liked a strong beard game.
Definitely. Even their gods started being shown with these Semitic features. And cosmetics were used as well.
And that brings us back to the seal cylinder we started with.
Yeah, that uniquely Babylonian invention, their personal ID, signature.
Because they didn't have much stone for carving other things.
Exactly. But they became amazing gem cutters very early on, carving these little cylinders. They'd engrave them with figures, gods, kings, scenes from myths like Gilgamesh, plus the owner's name, maybe their father's name, the god they served, the king.
So much more than just a signature then.
Oh, absolutely. It was drilled through so you could wear it on a string or sometimes mounted on a metal pin. You'd roll it across soft clay, leaving this unique, permanent impression. That was your mark, your legal sign-off.
And the source says it was just part of how a gentleman dressed.
Yes, part of the ordinary dress of the Babylonian gentleman. They used these impressions on contracts, obviously, but also on these little clay balls they'd wrap around documents. Basically sealed envelopes for an ancient postal system.
An ancient postal service.
And the impressions found on these envelopes from Sargon's time, they show incredible craftsmanship, belong to high officials. Really beautiful work.
That's fantastic. Okay, so beyond farming, you mentioned they were quite industrial.
Very much so. Babylonia was famous for its manufacturing. Even in classical times, people knew about Babylonian tapestries, mantles, high-value goods. Wool was huge, big flocks of sheep along the Euphrates, lots of weavers mentioned in contracts.
Were the tapestries like pictures or just patterns?
Often pictures, yeah.
Yeah.
Figures, animals, sometimes used instead of wall paintings or reliefs. They used vegetable dyes. The source even speculates they might have used Kermes dye, possibly sourced from the Indus Valley, which hints at maybe very early trade with India.
India, wow.
It's a suggestion, but yeah. Looms, weavers, they pop up constantly in the contracts. It underlines how big this industry was. I remember that example of Belshazzar, the king's son, involved in the wool trade via agents. That shows trade wasn't looked down on. It had high social standing.
Right, it wasn't beneath royalty. What other crafts were important?
Metalwork, definitely. Copper, bronze, later iron. For tools, dishes, all sorts of things. Metal was expensive, though. Often the customer would actually supply the raw metal. Carpenters made artistic furniture chairs with feet shaped like oxen, chests inlaid with ivory or gold. Wood itself was valuable in that land of clay.
And drinks. Did they make wine and beer?
Oh, yes. Vintners made wine from dates, which were abundant, but also grapes and even sesame. Beer from grain was common, too, and they imported wine. Armenian, Syrian, Lebanese wines were highly prized. The wine from Helbon near Damascus was famous later on.
So local production, but also sophisticated tastes and long-distance trade. What were the cities actually like, to walk through?
Well, the streets had shops, bazaars. Often no windows, just awnings stretched across for shade. Behind the shops, you'd find storehouses, maybe workshops for bigger industries like weaving. Streets actually had names.
They had street names.
They did, for keeping things clean. Well, scavenging dogs probably did a lot of the work. But the source mentions specific officials back in Hammurabi's time, whose job was looking after the city, the walls, the streets, sort of early sanitation officers.
Urban planning thousands of years ago. How did the economy work beyond just trading goods? Was there money?
In later periods, yes. Money, specifically pieces of silver that were weighed out the shekel. The mannae became the standard medium of exchange, though, interestingly, the price of wheat often still set the benchmark for the market.
So grain prices were fundamental.
Very. And the contracts give us amazing price lists. Wheat, dates, sesame, onions, sheep, oxen, clothes, metal tools. We know what things cost. One interesting point, skilled labor seems to have been relatively cheap. Workmen were often supplied with materials by the client and paid just for the labor itself.
So the value was more in the raw material.
Or perhaps the skill was more common compared to scarce resources like metal or good wood.
Yeah.
And crucial to this economy. Moneylenders. They basically acted as bankers.
Why were they so essential?
Well, in a trading society with limited standard coinage and no modern credit system, they facilitated everything. Especially since taxes usually had to be paid in actual silver, so people needed loans.
Did they charge interest?
Yes. The source suggests around 13.3% per year was a common rate. And loans required serious security fields, houses, date palm groves.
There must be tons of loan documents.
Thousands survive, detailing everything. The terms, the security pledged, witnesses, and we even know about famous banking families or firms like Egibi and Marasu. These were big operations, handling loans, trade, investments, lasting for generations, even through political upheavals.
Wow, ancient investment banks. And what about those trade partnerships, the Karin?
Yeah, Karan.
Mm.
The word itself means road or caravan, which strongly suggests these partnerships started as groups pooling their resources to fund trading expeditions to distant lands, offering mutual protection on dangerous journeys.
Safety in numbers for traders.
Exactly. Paints a picture of early long-distance trade as a communal, maybe even risky venture.
And just like loans, property deals were all written down too.
Absolutely. Detailed contracts for buying and selling houses, land. They describe the properties meticulously. They also reveal social customs, like how family consent was desirable for a sale, but maybe not strictly legally necessary to make it valid. They record how disputes and lawsuits over property were handled.
And that detail about the abakshish.
Yes, the custom of adding a little extra, a present or bonus, on top of the agreed price. The source highlights this as a cultural continuity, something you still see in the modern Middle East. A fascinating link across millennia.
So business wasn't just cold, hard contracts. There were these social rituals baked in.
Precisely. It shows how deeply business and social norms were woven together. Which leads us nicely into, well, what does all this mean for how people structured their relationships, their laws, their social hierarchy?
It sounds like law and contracts were absolutely everywhere.
They really were. Business customs seeped into everything. And notably, marriage itself was primarily viewed as a legal contract.
More so than a religious thing.
While there was likely a religious element, especially earlier on, the later Babylonian focus, as reflected in the contracts, was heavily on the legalities. Just like any major agreement, marriage needed written contracts, properly attested and signed, or sealed.
And this influenced other cultures.
This source suggests so, yeah, that this Babylonian practice influenced the Israelites during the exile, leading them to adopt written marriage contracts too. An ancient Sumerian text does describe a religious ceremony, but the Babylonian emphasis really shifted towards the contract.
Now, why the most striking things in the source, for me anyway, was the position of women, it sounds, remarkably independent.
This is genuinely one of the most significant takeaways. Forget the stereotypes of ancient women being completely powerless. In Babylonia, legally, women held a position almost equal to men in many respects.
That's huge. What could they actually do?
Well, they could own property, outright land, houses, slaves. They could inherit property, sometimes sharing with brothers, sometimes inheriting solely as daughters or sisters. They could engage in business. We see them selling slaves, borrowing money, even acting alongside their husbands in business deals.
They could go to court?
Yes. They could bring actions before judges. They could serve as legal witnesses. Their testimony counted.
That's real legal standing.
Absolutely. The dowry she brought to the marriage was important. And legally protected, it couldn't be alienated by the husband, especially if her parents were still alive, without their consent. The source even mentions an early queen, Elat Gula, who seems to have ruled in her own right. And kings often appointed their daughters to powerful positions like high priestesses.
Even the Assyrian reliefs show queens with kings.
Yeah, feasting alongside their husbands, suggesting a visible public status, even if Assyrian society might have differed slightly.
You mentioned marriage practices changing over time.
Significantly, yes. In earlier periods, like the time of Hammurabi, polygamy definitely existed. We have contracts describing a man marrying two sisters, for instance, where the second wife seems to serve the first, and interestingly, neither brought a dowry in that case.
But that changed later.
Dramatically. Later customs shifted so that if a man married a second wife, it automatically triggered a divorce from the first wife, even if the first wife hadn't brought a dowry that she could take back.
Wow, that's a major shift. How does the source interpret that?
It sees it as a sort of second victory for women's status. The old rule limiting women, no polyandry, was now applied to men in this new context. A man could have a successor to his wife, but not a contemporary rival with his wife.
Interesting interpretation. What about divorce and remarriage?
Both were possible. Divorced women were treated legally, much like widows, and could remarry. There's a deed confirming this from the reign of Hammurabi's father. Widows could also remarry freely. Children from different marriages were generally kept legally separate regarding inheritance, though a man might adopt his stepson to pass on property.
Were there penalties for infidelity?
Yes. Drowning was a stated punishment for an unfaithful wife, a practice still mentioned in the Hammurabi age. A secondary wife taken illicitly might face slavery. A husband, however, could apparently divorce his wife simply by paying her a sum of silver.
Now, the Greek historian Herodotus made that famous claim about compulsory public prostitution for all Babylonian women. Does this source back that up?
This is a really important correction the source makes. It explicitly refutes Herodotus' dramatic story. It says, yes, there were temple devotees associated with the goddess Ishtar, and there were public prostitutes who operated under the protection of the law. But crucially, they were a distinct class. They were separate from respectable women entering into marriage.
So Herodotus got it wrong or exaggerated?
The source strongly implies that. Marriage contracts from Hammurabi's time often include clauses specifying the bride has no stain or claim against her, emphasizing her respectable status. So a much more nuanced picture than Herodotus painted.
Okay. What about slavery? It was fundamental, right?
It was. But again, the source stresses how different it was from, say, later race-based slavery. Slaves were often from the same ethnic background as their masters. They could be seen almost as part of the extended family, could be adopted, could even gain freedom and rise to become citizens or high officials. Many were skilled artisans, many were literate.
So no inherent racial stigma.
No, not in the way we think of it later. Many slaves were prisoners of war, and the source points out that fortunes could change. A master might become a slave later, or vice versa.
How else did people become slaves?
Parents could sell children in times of hardship. Siblings could sell siblings. Creditors could take debtors into servitude under certain laws. An old Sumerian law even said a son who repudiated his father could be sold. And starkly, in famine, people might sell themselves into slavery simply to survive.
Why would they do that?
Because, the source notes, slaves were always fed and clothed by their masters. Some free laborers, in hard times, might not even have that guarantee.
That's a grim reality check. Did slaves have any legal protections?
Yes, even the earliest Sumerian laws offered some protection. There were fines if a master or someone who hired a slave injured or maimed them, fines payable daily until the slave recovered.
That's actually surprising. And the source mentions slaves owning property, even other slaves.
It's one of the most startling details, isn't it? The source gives an example. A slave who worked as a temple porter buying a female slave for a small amount of silver. And this wasn't unique to Babylonia. Assyrian law also protected slaves to some extent and allowed them to own property.
Incredible. What about foreigners living there? How were they treated?
Generally, quite fairly, it seems. They could own property, engage in trade, act as legal witnesses, and were protected by Babylonian law. The source does draw a slight contrast with Assyria, suggesting Assyria might have been quicker to integrate exiled populations as citizens, citing Israelite names appearing as free citizens and officials in Assyrian contracts relatively soon after deportation.
Okay, so we've covered the social structure, the laws. Let's shift gears a bit. How did they think about the world? What about education, learning, religion?
Education seems quite developed. There were schools, and these eventually grew into what ancient writers like Strabo called a famous university center at Borsippa near Babylon. It might have been particularly known for medicine.
And was literacy widespread? Or just for the elite?
This is a key difference the source highlights between Babylonia and Assyria. In Assyria, yes, literacy seems more confined to the upper classes and professional scribes, who had this very formal, standardized handwriting. But in Babylonia, literacy appears to have been far more common.
How do we know?
From the sheer variety of individual handwritings found on tablets, it suggests many more people were writing. The source mentions the son of a poor irrigator copying out literature. Even slaves could often read and write. It points to a much broader level of education in Babylonian society.
Did they learn other languages?
Yes, educated people certainly knew Sumerian. By this time, it was a dead language like Latin later in Europe, but it was the language of religion and ancient literature. And later on, by the 8th century BC or so, Aramaic became crucial.
Why Aramaic?
It became the lingua franca for trade and diplomacy across the entire Near East, spread by Aramean tribes and merchants. The source likens it to French in more recent history. Assyrian officials were definitely expected to know it.
We mentioned those clay envelopes for letters earlier. Was letter writing common?
Oh, incredibly ancient and very common. Using clay tablets and cuneiform script, of course. Thousands of letters survive. Not just official stuff, but personal letters between individuals, including women writing to kings, officials, family.
What kind of things did they write about?
All sorts. Health updates, business deals, reports from officials, doctors sending medical notes, astronomers reporting observations, lists of goods needed, requests for building supplies. It gives you this incredibly intimate window into their daily lives and concerns.
That's where you really connect with them as people. You mentioned astronomers. Was that linked to astrology?
Very much intertwined, yes. Studying omens' importance was seen as a serious science. They meticulously recorded unusual events in the sky, on Earth, and what happened afterwards, trying to find patterns. But out of this grew genuine astronomy. The source credits Babylonia as its birthplace.
So they were the first real stargazers.
Arguably, yes. They mapped the heavens, named stars and constellations, divided the path of the sun and moon into the 12 signs of the zodiac, names we still recognize today. They developed a sophisticated calendar.
Could they predict things like eclipses?
Lunar eclipses, yes, with remarkable accuracy. Solar eclipses were harder, but they tried. They studied comets, tracked the periods of the planets. Their calendar was lunar-based, 12 months of roughly 30 days, but they added an extra intercalary month periodically to keep it aligned with the solar year and seasons.
Did the months have names?
Yes, eventually named after the zodiacal signs, many of which survived, and they had a 7-day week, with each day dedicated to one of the main celestial bodies, which were also gods.
And the source mentioned the Sabbath, Sabbatu.
Yes, the 7th day was designated as a day of solemn rest, Sabbatu. The name seems to come from a Sumerian term meaning something like completing the heart or rest for the heart. They observed these Sabbaths on the 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28th days of the month, and also, oddly, the 19th day.
What did that mean in practice?
It meant no work allowed, and the rules were incredibly strict, especially for the king. On the Sabbath, he couldn't eat special food, couldn't change his clothes, couldn't ride in his chariot, couldn't issue decrees or hold court. Even prophets were forbidden from giving oracles or practicing medicine on that day.
That's astonishingly strict, especially for the ruler. What about their main gods and religious beliefs?
Well, the religion grew out of older Sumerian beliefs about countless spirits inhabiting everything. The Semitic influence transformed these into a more structured pantheon of distinct gods, figures like Bel or Marduk Merodach in Babylon,
Yeah.
Ea, god of wisdom and water, Anu, sky god, Sin, moon god, Nebo, god of writing.
And the goddess Istar, she seems prominent.
Very. Istar, or Ishtar, was unique. A powerful, independent goddess, really equal to the male gods. The source suggests this might stem from the Sumerian background, where the language didn't have grammatical gender and female figures held significant roles, allowing female deities to retain that independence. She was connected to similar goddesses across the Near East, like Astarte in Canaan.
And the story of Tammuz.
Tammuz started as a Sumerian spirit of maybe the spring floods or vegetation. He became this figure of the dying and rising god, the handsome shepherd beloved by Istar, tragically killed each year, symbolizing the death of vegetation in the summer heat or winter cold. The annual mourning rites for Tammuz, especially by women, were a huge part of the religious calendar. Istar's famous descent into the underworld to try and rescue him is one of their major myths.
A classic underworld journey myth. What was their general view of the afterlife?
Mostly pretty gloomy, actually. Hades, the underworld, was seen as this dusty, dark place underground where the dead existed as weak, strengthless ghosts eating dust. Not very appealing.
Not much hope there.
Not generally. Although the source does mention some later hints of brighter ideas. An Assyrian poet prays for his dead king to go to the land of the silver sky, which sounds a bit nicer. And kings were sometimes buried within their own palaces, which suggests maybe some continuing presence or status.
What about creation? Did they have a story for how it all began?
Yes, a major one, preserved in the creation epic known as Enuma Elish. It combines various older beliefs. It starts with primordial chaos, personified as the watery deep, Tiamat and Aksu. Then gods emerge. There's a big conflict, a cosmic battle between the younger gods representing order, led by Merodach in the Babylonian version, and Tiamat, the dragon of chaos.
And Merodach wins.
Yes. He defeats Tiamat, slices her body in two to create the sky and the earth, establishes the laws governing the stars and planets, and then creates plants, animals, and finally humans. Humanity is made from dust, mixed with the blood of a rebellious god, but importantly, they're also seen as linked to the gods, maybe even sons of the gods, made in their likeness.
Did they have sacred texts like a Bible?
They had collections of sacred writings, yes. Hymns, prayers, incantations, myths. While deep theological knowledge was probably restricted to priests and the educated elite, certain stories and hymns were likely widely known. This collection of hymns functioned a bit like a Bible and prayer book combined.
Were they in Sumerian?
Many of the oldest and most sacred hymns were in Sumerian, which, as we said, was like their Latin. So they often needed interlinear translations or pronunciation guides written in Akkadian, the Semitic language of Babylonia and Assyria. The instructions for rituals, the rubrics, were typically in Akkadian, but the prayers themselves might be in Sumerian, the pure or sacred language. Hymns were often marked to be recited, and frequently ended with the word Amanu, the origin of our Amen.
And worship was constant.
Seems like it. Incessant services, daily sacrifices, monthly festivals, fasts, even services held at night. New moons were observed very strictly.
What were their temples like physically?
Typically square or rectangular buildings, often with a large open courtyard inside. The most distinctive feature was usually the zikrat, that stepped temple tower. Each stage might be painted a different color, with a small shrine right at the top.
What was the point of the tower?
Probably several things. Symbolically, a stairway to heaven, linking earth and the divine. Practically, a high place for astronomical observations. The source compares them to the Canaanite high places. Herodotus described the top shrine of Babylon's Great Zikrat as having just a couch and a golden table, supposedly for the god to visit.
And inside the main temple building?
In the inner shrine, the Holy of Holies, you'd find the statue of the god, often a golden table for offerings like showbread and the paraku. That term is sometimes translated mercy seat or throne dais, and it seems to have been where oracles were delivered. There were altars for sacrifice, of course, and often a large bronze basin called the deep, representing the primeval waters, used for purification rituals. Sometimes these basins were supported by bronze oxen, like the one in Solomon's temple later.
Did they incorporate even older sacred spots?
Sometimes, it seems. Some temples might have enclosed or been built over much older sacred stones, vessels, houses of God. Perhaps these were anchored within the later temple structure, and offerings continued to be made to them. Shows a real layering of belief.
So alongside the grand gods and temples, there was also this belief in spirits, demons.
Oh, absolutely. The source paints a picture of a world teeming with malevolent spirits. Demons causing sickness, misfortune, mental distress, madness, epilepsy, things like that, were often seen as demonic possession.
So they needed protection.
Desperately.
Yeah.
Exorcism was a major practice. Specialist magicians, believed to get their knowledge from the god Kia, performed rituals to drive out demons. These spirits were thought to be especially active at night. You get belief in vampires, the nightmare demon.
And Lilith.
Yes. Lilat was seen as the wife of Lil, the ghost, and queen of the night demons. That figure was later borrowed into Jewish folklore as Lilith. The source even talks about a kind of dark priesthood, wizards, witches, sorcerers, even associating public prostitutes with serving these demonic forces. They worshipped a dark aspect of Istar, one who seized people at night, a slayer of youths.
How did people defend themselves?
Through counter-magic, exorcism rituals, protective amulets, placing special images teraphim at the doors of houses, images meant to tear the hearts of the wicked or slay the witch, and invoking the fire god, Gibel or Nusku, for purification and protection was very common.
Wow. A really complex spiritual world, high gods, advanced astronomy, but also this deep-seated fear of demons. Okay, finally, how was this incredibly layered society actually governed? What was their administration like?
Well, the king was central. And he was as much a religious leader, a pontiff, as he was a secular ruler. Especially in early Semitic thinking, the king himself was seen as divine. Figures like Sargon of Akkad, Naram-Sin, they were called gods while they were alive. Temples were built for them, priests served them.
But that changed. The king stopped being a god.
Yes, under the later Kassite dynasty that ruled Babylonia for a long time, the king was no longer considered divine. But he absolutely remained the supreme pontiff, the head of the state religion. His legitimacy, his right to rule Babylon, depended on performing a key annual ritual, symbolically taking the hands of Merodach, Babylon's patron god, who had become supreme in the pantheon.
And that act was important beyond Babylon.
Hugely important. The title King of Babylon carried immense prestige. It implied, in their worldview, the right to rule over all of Western Asia. So much so that even powerful Assyrian kings, when they conquered Babylon, felt they had to go to the city and perform that ceremony, take the hands of Bel, Merodach, to legitimize their own imperial rule. It wasn't just about controlling the territory. It was about claiming that mantle of supreme, divinely sanctioned kingship.
So Babylon was seen as the religious and maybe ideological center, while Assyria developed differently.
Right. While Babylonia remained focused on its priestly traditions, trade, industry, Assyria evolved into this incredibly powerful military and bureaucratic empire. The source gives a lot of credit to Tiglath-Pileser III, an Assyrian king, for really systematizing imperial control.
How did he do that?
Through deliberate planned conquest, organizing territories into provinces, appointing Assyrian governors, military commanders, administrators, establishing Assyrian colonies, basically creating the structures needed to run a fast, multi-ethnic empire efficiently. They were pioneers in imperial administration.
Did they keep good records of who held these posts?
Yes, very detailed lists of officials survive. And Assyria had a unique dating system. Each year was named after a high-ranking official, a governor, a general, sometimes the king himself. These officials were called limu, or eponyms. So events were dated in the year when X was limu.
Like a calendar based on officials.
Exactly. This eponym system spread quite widely, influencing dating in parts of Asia Minor, maybe even Greece. Babylonia, by contrast, usually dated years by events within the king's reign, year 5 of King Nebuchadnezzar, that kind of thing. They compiled lists of these regnal years later for chronology.
What were some of the top jobs at court?
Key civil roles included the Rabsaki, who was like the vizier or chief minister, that's the Rabshak mentioned in the Bible, and the Rabsaris, who seems to have been chief of administrative departments. On the military side, the top commander was the Tartano, or Tartan. He often led the army if the king wasn't personally campaigning, and the source suggests he ranked even higher than the Rabshak.
And the Assyrian army itself became legendary, didn't it?
Oh, incredibly effective, especially under the later empire. Highly organized into units, thousands, hundreds, fifties, tens. Known for strict discipline, constant innovation in weapons and armor, they developed effective cavalry, evolving from chariot teams which dominated on the plains, though less useful in mountains. They had heavy infantry, light infantry, siege engineers with battering rams and towers.
Where did the soldiers come from?
It was a mix. A core standing army, probably including mercenaries, troops levied from conquered populations, and underlying it all, a system of conscription drawing on the Assyrian peasantry. It was a real military machine.
And the source gives specific examples of administration in action,
Yeah.
like lawsuit.
Yes, those court records are fantastic. They show the whole process. The judges, who could be civil governors, sometimes priests, so not always serving together. The witnesses called, the arguments presented by both sides, the evidence considered, like contracts or witness testimony, and the final judgment recorded on a tablet.
Does it show how foreigners were treated in court?
It does. The source mentions one lawsuit involving settlers living outside a main city in the district of the Amorites. And it shows they had full legal standing, they could bring cases, participate in the Babylonian court system, and expect the law to be applied. It really brings the legal framework to life.
Okay, so we've covered a huge amount of ground here, navigating through the layers of life in ancient Babylonia and Assyria, all drawn from these fascinating primary sources and the handbook analyzing them.
Yeah, we've seen that incredible mix of peoples, Sumerian, Semitic, Kassite, forging the culture.
And how the land itself, that fertile but challenging plain, shaped everything: their work as farmers and engineers, their drive towards trade.
Then the sophistication of their laws, particularly those surprising rights for women, and even the protections and potential for slaves, which challenges a lot of assumptions.
Don't forget their intellectual life, widespread literacy in Babylon, the birth of astronomy mixed with astrology, the complex religious world with its grand gods, intricate rituals, and those ever-present demons.
And finally, the powerful, structured governments holding it all together, from divine kingship to the bureaucracy of empire.
And the key thing, I think, is that this wasn't just dry history, was it? These were real people dealing with things we still deal with: family, work, justice, belief, how to communicate across distances.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Seeing their world revealed through their own writings, their contracts, their letters, it gives us such vital context for understanding everything that came after in the region. And even further afield, you find these surprising echoes.
Totally. Bits of their calendar system, fundamental ideas about contracts and witness testimony, maybe even some deep-seated superstitions or ideas about days of rest. You can trace these threads back thousands of years.
It really underscores how much of our shared human story has roots planted deep in the Mesopotamian soil.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Just consider how a civilization that built its world on clay tablets and date palms, a civilization that was simultaneously mapping the stars with incredible accuracy and performing elaborate rituals to ward off night demons. How could that world lay foundations that would ripple outwards for millennia, shaping everything from how we sign our names on a document to how we think about the structure of our week? It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.